Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. On this week's episode, we'll be covering natural disasters that happened in the Philippines and Indonesia, the arrest of Indonesia's former trade minister, and 5 Singapore-based firms sanctioned by the US. We'll also be covering a Thai YouTuber being arrested in Indonesia. I'm Lauren Mai. Today is November 14th, 2024. Last week, Greg and Elina were joined by Ong Kian Ming to discuss Malaysia's upcoming ASEAN Chair year. But before that, let's start with our headlines. Hey everyone, while Japheth is in the region, it'll be just me on the podcast today. So hopefully you guys don't get tired of my voice. We're starting off our stories in Indonesia, where a prominent Thai YouTuber was arrested after 2 years on the run. With over 800,000 followers, Nathamon Kongchak, popularly known as Nutty, was well known for her singing and dancing videos. But she fled Thailand in July 2023 after defrauding her followers out of $59 million in a foreign exchange trading scam and positioning herself as an investment guru. Now, over a year later, Nutty was finally arrested in Indonesia and extradited back to Thailand in late October. The part of the story that has gotten netizens a buzz, however, is how she was caught. She had reportedly tried to obtain an Indonesian passport, but immigration officers suspected something was amiss when they detected her accent and asked her to sing the Indonesian national anthem, which she had failed to do. She definitely should have done her homework before trying to make that move. On to our next story. The Philippines has been struggling with successive storms over the past several weeks. Authorities last week issued evacuation orders and placed troops on standby as Typhoon Yinxing hit the region. While there were no casualties reported, the storm brought torrential rain, storm surges, and landslides. Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. visited communities in Cagayan and Ilocos Norte impacted by Typhoon Yinxing. Another typhoon, Toraji, slammed into the eastern coast of Luzon's Aurora with winds equivalent of a Category 1 Atlantic hurricane, prompting the evacuation of thousands of people. This week, 2 tropical storms, Usagi and Manyi, are intensifying in the waters near the Philippines. Usagi, currently located about 750 kilometers, or 460 miles northeast of Luzon, is expected to strengthen to a typhoon by Tuesday evening as it approaches the region. Meanwhile, Manyi is moving westward and is projected to become a typhoon that could potentially impact the northeastern Philippines by early next week. Although it remains uncertain whether either storm will make a direct landfall, heavy rains, strong winds, and dangerous storm surges are anticipated along affected coastal areas. Over in Indonesia, residents of Flores Island are dealing with a disaster of a different kind. Mount Loatobi Laki-Laki recently erupted, leading to the tragic loss of 9 lives and forcing thousands of residents to flee their homes. As the volcano continues to show signs of activity, Indonesian authorities have ramped up evacuation efforts, aiming to move people out of hazardous areas. They've announced plans for the permanent relocation of communities situated in high-risk zones to protect residents from future eruptions. The Indonesian Natural Disaster Mitigation Agency has estimated that approximately 16,000 people will need to be evacuated and has deployed resources to provide shelter, food, and healthcare to those displaced. Temporary camps have been set up to accommodate evacuees, while the government works to finalize relocation sites for those who cannot safely return to their homes. As both the Philippines and Indonesia brace for the effects of these natural calamities, the resilience of their people and the preparedness of their governments are being tested. We'll continue monitoring the situation and the relief efforts underway to support those impacted. Continuing our focus in Indonesia, former Trade Minister Thomas Lembong has been arrested over a graft case involving sugar import permits from 2015. Prosecutors allege that Lembong approved the importation of 105,000 metric tons of raw crystal sugar despite a national surplus, resulting in an estimated $25 million loss to the state. This permit was allegedly issued without the required consultation with other state bodies or recommendations from the industry ministry, violating a 2004 regulation that limits raw sugar imports to the state-owned enterprises. The investigation, led by the Attorney General's office, involved over 90 witnesses and concluded that the benefits of this permit went to 8 private companies instead of the designated state trading firm PPI, causing significant financial loss to the government. The arrest has drawn major political interest, especially given Lembong's recent role as a campaign manager for presidential candidate Anies Baswedan. Baswedan was set to run against Prabowo Subianto, the eventual victor in the election and widely supported candidate of former President Jokowi. With Lembong's arrest coming so soon after the election, speculation has arisen about possible political motivations behind the investigation. In the wake of these developments, former officials from Indonesia's anti-corruption agency, the Corruption Eradication Commission, have called on Lembong to cooperate by identifying any members of the alleged sugar import mafia. This term refers to a purported network of influential figures who control Indonesia's lucrative import sector through unlawful practices. By acting as a justice collaborator and exposing these actors, Lembang could assist authorities in addressing larger patterns of corruption within the trade industry. The case has prompted numerous questions, particularly regarding the nearly decade-long delay in investigating these claims. Observers are watching closely to see whether further investigations will identify additional figures involved in the sugar permit decision-making process. The outcome of this case could have significant implications for Indonesia's broader efforts to address corruption in government and business. I'll end today's headlines in Singapore, where 5 Singapore-based companies were sanctioned by the US. The companies were put on the specially designated nationals list by the US Treasury Department Office of Foreign Assets Control. The US government announced that the sanctions were in response for their roles in aiding Russian efforts in the Ukraine war. 4 of the firms were named as being part of a network of shipping companies which aided Russian LNG producer Novatek to obtain vessels for its operations and to circumvent US sanctions. The 4 firms were all majority owned by a Novatek subsidiary, but were all registered to the same address in Singapore. The 5th company was identified for shipping around $4.5 million worth of high-priority electrical equipment to Russian-based companies. This incident highlights the difficulty that Singapore faces as one of the world's most market-oriented and open economies in the world, attracting significant external investment while trying to balance its dealings with countries such as Russia, Myanmar, and North Korea. And that wraps up our headlines for today. If we missed anything that you wanted to hear about, do write us at scaradio@csis.org, and we'll get back to you. Up next, Greg and Elina's conversation with Ong Kian Ming. Stay tuned!
Welcome back. I am Greg Poling, joined as usual by Elina Noor of the Carnegie Endowment. Hey, Elina.
Good to see you again, Greg.
And this time I'm the one traveling. Elina is back home in the States, and I am coming to everybody from Manila, which makes it, I guess, a late afternoon for Elina, but right on time for our guest, who's joining us from KL. Ong Kian Ming is a former MP and Deputy Minister of International Trade and Industry in Malaysia, now with Taylor's University. Kian Ming, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Hi, Greg. Hi, Elina. Always good to engage with you guys, especially on topics of interest.
Yeah, it's election season in the U.S. right now. The election's going to be tomorrow, based on where we're recording. So for those listening, Elina and I guessed right. Whatever happens tomorrow. We're going to talk about more important matters, ASEAN. So as of last month, Malaysia officially became the ASEAN chair for 2025. And we wanted to have Kian Ming on to talk about what you think Malaysia's priorities will be. From what I've seen, we've had a few statements from Prime Minister Anwar. We've had a few from Foreign Minister Hassan. They've been rather vague. You know, we've heard statements about potentially advancing the code of conduct on the South China Sea. I think the one thing that they've been clear on both is a renewed focus on the crisis in Myanmar. But I guess in general, what do you think are going to be the top priorities for the Anwar government taking over the chair?
I think consistent with Anwar Ibrahim's foreign policy over the past 2 years, priority number 1 would be to try to be friends with everyone and to try to have an inclusive as possible a dialogue. And we can go into some of the challenges associated with that later. I think secondly, with regards to some of the main themes, it's already been announced that the theme of ASEAN for 2025 will be sustainability and inclusivity. And I think those are priorities that are not just close to the heart of this Madani government in Malaysia, but also consistent with some of the aspirations of the other ASEAN countries and perhaps dialogue partners as well. So I think sustainability, digital economy, wanting to reduce some of the gaps between the haves and the have-nots, that would be sort of like another bucket of priorities for the Malaysian chair.
Just rewind a bit, Kian Ming, for our audience who might not be familiar with the Madani concept, could you just do a brief intro on what it is?
Sure, yeah. The Madani concept is something that was conceived by people close to Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim here in Malaysia. If you were to sort of like summarize it into English, it would be a civilizational and inclusive government, meaning wanting to have a progressive and forward-looking government based on values that are consistent with civilizational dialogues that have been ongoing between the major civilizations in the world over the past centuries. And the reason why I bring in civilization is because this was one of the main themes of a book that was written by Anwar called the Asian Renaissance. I think he wrote it when he was Deputy Prime Minister, or somebody wrote it for him and he endorsed it. These principles have come up again under his administration starting from December 2022.
And you think there'll be some consistency between his domestic policy and his foreign policy during the ASEAN Chairmanship?
Oh yeah, definitely. So in addition to some of these civilizational principles, which would be important in terms of trying to balance between US and China and some of the other great powers, I think you would also see him try to find suitable ways and platforms to highlight the issues pertaining to the genocide that's happening in Gaza and also the conflict in other parts of the Middle East.
I saw one interview that Prime Minister Anwar gave, I think it was during the visit to India recently, where he said a top priority for the chairmanship will be to help manage U.S.-China tensions in the region, which speaks to this idea of, being friends with everybody, focusing on ASEAN neutrality. This is a tough gig for anybody. The ASEAN consensus on any issue on the world stage, except maybe Gaza, it seems more fractured than ever before. And we've seen this, for instance, with Prime Minister Anwar's invitation to Vladimir Putin to attend the ASEAN summit next year, which is certainly going to irritate Singapore and the Philippines, as well as other outside dialogue partners. Does it really seem feasible that Malaysia can try to bridge those gaps and manage U.S.-China competition, given the huge differences of opinion among the members on issues like the Russian war in Ukraine, the South China Sea?
I think that's an excellent question. That leads me to one of the biggest challenges, I think, with regards to Malaysia's chairmanship of ASEAN, which is, even though the broad parameters probably more apparent to Malaysian watchers and also to ASEAN watchers, but the strategic imperatives and also the process by which these larger strategic goals are to be reached currently is not clear. And it's not clear to me, and I sort of consider myself an insider, outsider, or an outsider insider, if you will. The example that you brought up is a very good illustration of what I mean by this lack of strategic coordination and thinking, which is when Prime Minister Anwar went to Russia to attend the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok. The objective then was to try to signal Malaysia's intention of wanting to join BRICS. And I think when the invitation was made to Putin to come to ASEAN, I don't think Prime Minister Anwar made the strategic consideration of how this would impact the decision by, let's say, whoever's in the White House to come or not. And also what other ASEAN countries may think about this. That kind of more of what I would say personality-driven or friendship-driven or interaction-driven kind of foreign policy engagements that may not work so well from a strategic perspective when you're the host of ASEAN, where you have to put things into institutional context, if you know what I mean.
It almost seems as if you're saying it was like an instinctive nicety of him to have invited Putin. But do you think that Anwar Ibrahim broached the ASEAN GCC China Summit, which is a natural evolution of some of the meetings that have been had between ASEAN and the GCC on the one hand, ASEAN and China on the other hand? Do you see this as the same lines of him inviting Putin, just trying to broaden the relationship beyond the norm for ASEAN in general?
And sorry, GCC being Gulf Cooperation Council for listeners who aren't familiar with every acronym.
Yeah, good point, Greg. Yeah, I think, the ASEAN GCC dialogues and the ASEAN China dialogues have been going on for quite some time. So it's quite a novel idea, in terms of trying to bring GCC and China on the same table together with ASEAN. And I think there are some good reasons to consider that. But going back to my concern of the lack of strategic thinking and coordination, I'm not quite sure whether the people in the foreign policy establishment here in Malaysia and even the people within the Prime Minister's office has done the right kind of floating of trial balloons and different kind of engagements, backdoor or sort of like quiet engagements to find out the sentiment and also the pathway towards materializing this particular way of bringing together the GCC and also China. So doesn't mean that it is a bad idea. It's just that without the kind of strategic thinking, you may float an idea out and then find that it's shot down or it's not so easily implemented, similar to the way in which the invitation was issued to Putin, but not really thinking about the repercussions of that. Because it is all fine and good to say that, oh, Malaysia is a sovereign country. We can invite whoever we want to come to Malaysia. But as chair of ASEAN, where there's a lot more geopolitical complications, especially if, let's say, you have the aspiration of wanting to be a bridge builder between US and China, you would not be able to achieve that objective if, let's say, the US president decides to not come to Malaysia because Putin is coming to Malaysia.
One of the other issues that I imagine being really difficult for Prime Minister Anwar to navigate will be the South China Sea, partially because Malaysia's laid out a rather ambitious agenda. We've heard Malaysian officials suggest that maybe we can push a code of conduct forward in 2025, which is a year faster than ASEAN is actually, than the ASEAN Secretary General said. And senior ASEAN officials have told me they don't think that there's any chance of that possibly happening. But it's also going to be difficult because there's been a clear and growing schism between Malaysia and the Philippines. I mean, plenty of ASEAN states have expressed some concern about the Philippines over the last year, but Malaysia's public criticism of Manila has been unique. Foreign Minister Hassan basically blamed the Philippines for South China Sea tensions at the ARF publicly, which is unusual to point the finger at another ASEAN state. So how do you imagine that Malaysia, given that very scratchy relationship, and also I think quietly a pretty scratchy relationship with Vietnam? We just saw a report this week about Malaysia sending a diplomatic note to Vietnam complaining about Vietnam's island building efforts. Is Malaysia really positioned to be a neutral arbiter in convening discussions in the South China Sea in the coming year?
I think, Greg, you've pointed to one of the associated challenges with this kind of what I've publicly called an unbalanced balancing act by Anwar Ibrahim in an article that I wrote in The Fulcrum, a publication of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, or ICS. And this is where I think the lack of strategic thinking is also something that is apparent, or at least a subject of speculation among those that observe politics in Southeast Asia vis-a-vis some of the great powers. And I'll give you a couple of other specific examples that link to the concerns that you brought up just now, which is the perception that Malaysia is gravitating more towards China in this unbalanced balancing act between the US and China. So even though we are openly saying that we want to court investments from China and the United States, which is true, and that process will continue, but there are certain things which Prime Minister Anwar have said that doesn't show the same kind of decorum or the presence of strategic thinking in this balancing act. So the examples that I'll bring up would be recently, he said at a forum or an open public event here in Malaysia that Anthony Blinken at the ASEAN summit in Laos asked Malaysia not to be so nice to Russia. I think those were the words that Prime Minister Anwar said. Anwar's reply was that we'll be nice to whoever we want to be nice to, right? So that's sort of like a declaration of Malaysia's sovereignty and maybe would win some claps from the domestic audience because of what's happening in Gaza. But I have not heard Prime Minister Anwar come out to say, oh, this is what I've said to President Xi or Premier Li Qiang with regards to some of the incursions that we've seen by Chinese vessels in the South China Sea, including in Malaysian waters, right? Or we've not seen Prime Minister Anwar come out to publicly say that, yes, we are concerned about the leak of diplomatic note from China to Malaysia with regards to some of the activities in the South China Sea. And I will bring up these issues to President Xi or Premier Li Qiang. And Prime Minister Anwar is in China at the moment, where he will meet with both leaders, Premier Li Qiang in Shanghai and also President Xi in Beijing. So with this kind of outward posturing, my concern is that Malaysia would not seem to be neutral arbiter, and maybe even more concerning, not a professional arbiter between some of these great powers.
I mean, not that this is any baseline, but there are few balanced arbiters in the world these days anyway.
You're probably right. I would say different players are wanting to play that role. Even China, I think they want to be seen as a bit more neutral in some of the conflicts that we see in the Middle East. But yeah, I mean, it's all part and parcel of this foreign policy merry-go-round that we find ourselves in.
But I was going to ask you, what do you think Malaysia could do to demonstrate strategic thinking during its chairmanship year of ASEAN with regard to the South China Sea issue? I'll hold off on the Myanmar question for now because I think one is hard enough.
Yeah, I think signaling the pathway towards achieving whatever short or long-term objectives that we have is one way of doing it. whereby the focus rightly is on ASEAN, but there needs to be some sort of a continuity in this kind of COC understanding and negotiation. This means that there needs to be different platforms of engagement. It's not just at the formal level, but at the track 1.5, track 2 level, getting think tanks, and which of course you guys are very familiar with, to float different trial balloons, to get different stakeholders sharing their viewpoints on the difficulty, the challenges, as well as the opportunities, asking people who are close to the administration to write position articles, for example, to test possible pathways and to invite open discussion among these foreign policy experts. I think those are all ways in which we can see a more consistent and strategic direction moving forward. But frankly speaking, I see very, very little of that happening in the Malaysian context. I'm not saying that it is easy to do. I think it takes a firm and experienced hand. I think probably Singapore is the country that I will point to as having the most consistent and strategic and long-term engagement approach in areas of its own interests, and seeing beyond that would be looking at some of the institutional interests of ASEAN. But I don't see the same kind of structure within the Malaysian ecosystem right now.
Okay, then I'll ask about Myanmar. That is one clear priority that Anwar has laid out. I mean, not only is it a mind-numbingly difficult issue given the ongoing failure of any progress on ASEAN's 5-point consensus, but it's also something that probably pits Malaysia's efforts against the preferences of other ASEAN states, especially Thailand, and also pits Malaysia's approach against the approach of China, which China increasingly, since Operation 1027, views the NUG and the K3C and other affiliated EROs as too democratic, too close to the West. Those are exactly the actors that Malaysia wants to see more engagement with on the ASEAN level. So how the heck is Malaysia going to navigate that while still trying to be this friend to everybody?
Great question, Greg. And I think here I would point to one of the very noticeable gaps that I see in Malaysia's foreign policy at the moment, whereby if you compare the current foreign minister, Muhammad Hassan, to the foreign minister in the previous government, Saifuddin Abdullah took a much more public and concerted viewpoint with regards to Myanmar, looking for different domestic as well as international platforms to voice out concern with regards to Myanmar, including in some policy dialogues in Singapore when he was foreign minister. I think Muhammad Hassan has been much more circumspect and careful, taking the lead from Anwar. But I think as a result of this kind of, how shall I say, a much more careful approach towards highlighting issues of concern with regards to Myanmar, I think Malaysia's own foreign policy approach towards wanting to manage this situation is less credible than it could have been. If that is the case, if my supposition is seen as reflective of what other ASEAN countries are thinking as well, then the momentum towards seeking some sort of a pathway forward on the Myanmar question, I think would be lacking. And I think if, let's say, the same kind of lack of strategic coordination that we've seen in other areas of foreign policy is also reflected in terms of how we engage with some of the stakeholders that you mentioned just now, including Thailand and also China. What I'm afraid would happen is that there will be a lot of talk and rhetoric, but nothing of substance, I think, will emerge from that discussion.
So as Greg introduced you, Kian Ming, you were Malaysia's Deputy Minister of International Trade and Industry, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't draw on your experience and expertise to ask about where you should see Malaysia leading ASEAN in terms of the economic pillar, because many, including myself, have said that that's probably the strongest pillar in ASEAN. And we've talked a lot about the foreign policy failures of ASEAN so far, so I'd like to take us on an up note, if we will.
Oh yeah, I'll be happy to talk about this because this is where I'm the most optimistic about. I think all signs are very positive on the economic front for the ASEAN countries, especially with regards to the inflow of foreign direct investment. And this is partly driven by US-China tensions that will continue regardless of who wins the White House. And of course, democracy hopefully will prevail in this case. So that kind of interest in ASEAN from an FDI perspective will also drive increased domestic direct investment as well. And that will hopefully be some sort of positive note that Malaysia and ASEAN can leverage on. And I think some of the areas that I want to highlight would be discussions in the digital economy space, how DeFi is going to be prioritized and move forward. This is the Digital Economic Framework Agreement that achieved quite a lot of progress under, if I'm not mistaken, Indonesia's chairmanship. How do we want to think about upgrading some of the free trade agreements that we have between ASEAN and some of our most important trading partners, including China, India? And then also some discussion on how we want to increase the level of coordination within ASEAN countries as part and parcel of the ASEAN proposition of attracting FDI. And this would include, for example, how we want to discuss freer movement of people within the ASEAN countries with regards to work permits being loosened or being given better treatment within member ASEAN countries. And then even as we compete against one another, whether there are areas of possible cooperation. And one example that maybe Malaysia would like to highlight would be the signing of the Johor Singapore Special Economic Zone that will take place in December 2024 as an example of how there can be cross-border sort of like a special economic zone agreements and arrangements between different ASEAN countries. So yeah, definitely a lot of things to talk about and to highlight in this space.
I guess one last question for me that I've heard Malaysian officials reference. Do you think Malaysia will be able to seal Timor-Leste's accession as the 11th member, or is 2025 still going to be too soon?
I know of that effort. I think many of the other ASEAN countries are looking forward to that as well. I would not be in a position to say to what extent Malaysia has engaged deeply with the ASEAN Secretariat and also with Timor-Leste as to their preparedness. But of course, if that can be done, it will be a feather in the cap. And I hope it can be done, but I would not be too optimistic about that happening. Unless, of course, Anwar can pull off one of his very charming foreign policy moves, which I think in the ASEAN context may not be so likely. I think overall, I can say that I'm cautiously optimistic about the direction of ASEAN moving forward, especially on the economic front. But I think on the security and the political front, we have to acknowledge that ASEAN is a slow-moving creature. And I think the way that geopolitics is shaping out to be, it really takes a firm hand to be able to navigate those complexities, which I think Anwar, maybe he'll get there, but, he's only been in prime minister for 2 years and he was in opposition for 25 years. So I think trying to learn the muscles of foreign policy engagements, especially from an institutional perspective, is one that we should look closely at.
All right, we'll have to end the conversation there. Kian Ming, thank you so much for taking the time. And Elina, thanks as always. Most especially, thank you for listening again. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at scaradio@csis.org, and we'll get back to you. Do us a favor and subscribe, and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, or whatever streaming platform that you listen to us on. Tell your friends about us. Marla Hiller is our producer, and our interns are Narupat Ratanikit and Natanya Sia. Our co-hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Lauren Mai, and I'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.